Here today.
Great. Okay. So, welcome everyone to Agential Topics. This is another discussion sponsored by Talking Octopus. Talking Octopus is an organization dedicated to building a robotic model of agential biology. And to do that, we have to first understand what agential biology is. So today we have a special guest, Mike Levin, and Mike is from the Allen Center Discovery Center at Tufts University. Um, Many of you already know Mike, and many of you know each other. Um, so we have a few more participants today than we have sometimes in the past. So we thought maybe one way to kind of get into things was for the first like 20, 30 minutes or so, I have a series of questions that I wanted to ask Mike and just kind of go through them just so we sort of lay the groundwork for the discussion I'm hoping to have, which is about inheritance and cognition. And I sort of framed that question in the email invitation, but I wanted to give Mike a chance to just sort of define some of his terms and some of his concepts, and hopefully we can explore um, the the question about inheritance and cognition when we get there. So um, yeah, so I'll get started. Mike, if you want to say a word to introduce yourself, or you want to just have me jump right in with the first question, or
But what can I say? Yeah, I work at Tufts University. Hey, Catherine. And my lab does a number of things that from the outside kind of look like regenerative medicine, bioengineering. We do a little bit of AI and some things like that. But fundamentally, I think what we're interested in is understanding embodied mind and how cognition can function in the physical world and how we can better interface with it both on a practical level and on an ethical level. So that's kind of what we do. So yeah, go for it.
awesome. Yeah, so the first question is the easiest question. What is the boundary between life and non-life?
Oh yeah, you just started off with the easy stuff. Um, well, let's see. So my perspective is this. I only like boundaries in very rare cases when the presence of the boundary is helping you in some way. I find overall that most categories like that, when people try to define them with sharp boundaries, they're more constrictive than they are enabling. And so I don't like boundaries overall. What I do like are continua and trying to tell a story of what is the theory of change by which something sort of moves across that continuum. And yes, we can give names. So I think what happens with life and not life is that we give names to certain categories of things, but we have to be very careful. I think a lot of these things work like the word adult, right? So if you think about the word adult, it helps the legal system do things and whatever, but we all know that nothing special happens on your 18th birthday that puts you in a magically different category. So if you really want to understand what an adult is, it's a lengthy and difficult discussion about development and personal responsibility and all of this kind of stuff. But in practical terms, you get on with it when you say, okay, 18, you're an adult. So I think life is a little bit like that. I think for certain purposes, it's nice to have these categories, but if we really, as we are here, we really it's kind of like neuron. You know, if you're in anatomy 101, everybody needs to just agree this is a neuron and let's just get on with it. But at a real conference, I will always say, no, what is a neuron? And then everybody says, come on, a neuron. And they said, no, really, what is it? And they list some properties, and then I point out that every cell in the body does those things, and then we can have a deep discussion of what do you really want from a neuron. So I think life is kind of like that. I think we tend to call living things that are very good at scaling the cognitive light cone of their parts into a larger scale collective that is operating into new problem spaces. So we call life those things that tend to be really good at aligning their parts to some particular story, some particular world model that they will all sort of align to, and then execute a goal directed, some example of goal directed behaviors in some kind of new problem space. Another way of putting it more recently, which I wouldn't have said this last year, but now I'm sort of talking about this Platonic space stuff. So I would say that things we call life are things that are very good at being interfaces for the specific kinds of patterns from that space that we associate with goal directedness, with valence, with agential behavior, with intelligence, and so on. But all of it is a continuum, and I don't think there's any sharp distinctions you really. And I think that we have to be very careful at these kinds of divisions where people say, well, living things do this, and then dumb machines or matter does that. I think we have to be extremely careful, because what we see is that some of the things that we associate with life and mind, in fact, start to creep in very minimal physical embodiments, extremely minimal. And we are not very good at noticing those. We can kind of tell when we're looking at a primate or maybe a whale or something that is doing interesting things. But actually, those kinds of things at smaller degrees creep in very minimal embodiments. So you have to be really careful about using these words and thinking that we really know that we've sort of cut nature into some sort of distinct category.
Cool. What are memories? What is the physical basis of memory?
Do you mean broadly, or do you mean behavioral memories?
I guess I'm thinking of a definition that can scale up and down, that can go all the way down to single cells, or like just from the point you're just making, maybe beyond, maybe even to a lower level than that.
Okay. I guess I would define it as um, some kind of mechanism that allows a system to to benefit from past experience and act differently in the future. It's a scratch pad that you can use in your navigation of some problem space. It might be three-dimensional space as studied in conventional behavior. It might be things related to other kinds of spaces, so transcriptional, gene expression space, physiological space, and so on. But in all cases, uh, the kind of more obvious thing is that it's a mechanism used as a scratch pad so that you can store in some way evidence of your encounters with the past. But I think more interestingly, it's actually the more interesting component of it actually is, I think that uh, memories need to be interpreted. I think memories are messages from your past self, and like all messages, whether laterally from other beings or from past you, messages are up to your interpretation. And in particular, I think, and we can dig into this if you want, but I think, but this kind of harkens back to the life conversation. One of the things that distinguishes, I think, uh, uh, standard living forms from the machines that we have today is that life fundamentally deals with unreliable substrate, and it is committed to creative interpretation of its own memories. I think that that's a huge theme in biology, is that whether those be your genetic memories on large scale, or your behavioral memories, or your developmental affordances, whatever it is, you don't actually know what any of them means. And that's important, because then you're free to creatively interpret them in novel circumstances. And this is how you get this amazing problem solving capacity that we see, like the ability to handle novel problems. Most of our engineering architectures are not like that. You have error correction, and you have all these abstraction layers to make sure that you can rely on your substrate. And when you're programming these high level languages, you don't need to worry about the copper or the fact that your register is going to float off and do something. We kind of assume you know what everything means, and then we can agree on it and make sure it stays fidelity of the information. I think life is not doing that, and I think it's massively important that you don't have access to the past. You have access to the memory traces, to the engrams that were left in your brain and body by previous you, based on past experience. And now you have to you have to actively reconstruct those memories into some story of what you are and what the outside world is and what you should do next. And I think we're doing this constantly. And that's I think that's probably the most interesting thing about those.
So just a kind of a follow-up, this wasn't on our list, but I'm trying to link these two. Um, so if you don't think that there's a sharp distinction between life and non-life, do you think that there's a sharp boundary between self and non-self? And if so, are memories contained in the self, within that self boundary?
So I do think that at any given moment, a system will have uh, some assessment of where its boundaries are. right? And now, but however, that can change over time, and we study a number of examples where that happens, where the border between self and world grows and shrinks, and that can be good or bad depending on the scenario. And also, you might have subcomponents that disagree about where the borders are, and so I don't think that, and in fact, you'll have right. So Josh Bongard and I work on this thing called polycomputing, where basically you have to pick a perspective, and it might be, yes, of course, from the system's own perspective, but also from various observers. So that means your own parts, that means the system in which you're embedded, parasites, conspecifics, other kinds of hackers that might be trying to modify you. All of them have their own vision of where it is useful to draw a border. And that's, I think, all it really is an, the most useful model you can muster around where are the borders of yourself. And I like for like demarcating that, I like the size of the biggest goals that you can pursue. I think the borders of yourself are in many ways informed by the size of the goals that you as a goal seeking system can implement. But I don't think they're objectively fixed. They're quite fluid most of the time.
Cool. So what makes material agential?
So what I mean by an agential material, what I mean by any of these mentalistic terms actually is interaction protocols. So I don't really think that any of these terms, when you say something is intelligent or whatever, any of these kinds of terms, I don't think we're really making claims about what things are. I think what we're doing is specifying a proposed interaction protocol, and you're saying this is how I plan to relate to the system, and then everybody else we can all see how well that worked out for you. So you take an estimate of you have a system and you say, well, I don't think this is I think this is a stupid hardwired machine, or I think this is a highly agential being, or I think it's something in between. What you're saying is, here's a set of tools that I bring to this, and those tools can be anything from physical rewiring to cybernetics, control theory, behavioral science, psychoanalysis, love and friendship, and wherever you are on that spectrum, right? And a material, I would say, is agential to the extent that you would benefit from using the tools further on the right side of that spectrum, meaning that it has competencies, it has agendas, it has maybe some degree of problem solving capacity or learning capacity, or some aspects that would cause you to interact with it using some of those tools. So in a non-agential, or a low age, I should say, more accurately, a low agential material, all that stuff is negligible, and we've been engineering with wood and metal and things like that for a long time. And when you do that, it's on you to implement every piece of what you want. The material at best is just going to hold its shape. It's not going to do anything other than sit where you put it. And at best, and occasionally it'll even, fail you there. It'll break down or whatever. But ideally, it just kind of holds its shape. And that means when you engineer, it is on you as the engineer to make everything happen. You have to micromanage all the parts of it. An agential material, such as when we do our work in developmental bioengineering or any of that stuff, is a material where that is not the best way to engineer. You already know the material has certain competencies. It has goals that you're going to need to either respecify or work around, because it is not just going to sit where you put it. It has abilities to solve certain problems, which are great if you're an engineer, because you can offload a lot of that stuff onto the material. You don't have to solve it, and most of the time we don't even know how to solve it. We're happy the system does it because we have no idea how to do it. And it has some interesting behaviors. For example, oftentimes it has a hierarchical organization, which means that you can control it via high level stimuli. You can communicate with it, give it suggestions, and it will go and integrate all the downstream stuff that we, again, have no idea how to control and have no desire to control. So it has these different layers where you don't have to talk to the bottom layer of the physics. You can talk to a much higher layer that has memories, expectations, and whatever, and you can let it solve the problem. If you want, I can describe a bunch of those examples.
So just so I'm getting it like clear in my mind, with non-living material, could you like give two examples of one that's less agential and one that's more agential? Like
Well,
is clay more agential than sand? Or I mean, just in terms of what
yeah.
kind of problems it can solve.
Well, so there's a bunch of interesting work, and you want to talk to people like Robert Batterman and some other folks who do active matter research. So I'm not actually an expert on that stuff, but there are a bunch of interesting examples. But I'm gonna give you the dumbest, like lowest level example, just because I think it's instructive to see like how far down it goes. So when I say these things go all the way down, um, imagine what I'm really talking about here is what degree of autonomy does your material have? What can you count on it to do? Right? And if you're an engineer and you have a thermostat module, you would be very well off to understand that this thing has, it's not a scintillating conversationalist or anything, but it has one competency that it has, which is that it knows how to keep something in a particular range. And as an engineer, you will be well advised to take it, to know that and take advantage of it. And if you get an HVAC technician in your house who doesn't believe in that, then you probably need somebody else, right? Like it's important for practical things. So here's a very simple example. You're building a roller coaster, and you have to do a bunch of work as an engineer to get the thing up to the top of the hill. But what you don't have to do is build in a mechanism to force the thing to go down. You can rely on that, and again, minimal, right? Super minimal, but it's not zero. It's something. It's something you can rely on the material to do without you being there to micromanage that aspect of it. And I think every kind of engineering, all the way down to the very sort of passive matter, is about that. It's like what can I expect this thing to do on its own that I don't need to worry about? And there's plenty of examples of that among materials, but life is where this really cranks up, because it becomes this multi-scale thing where the higher levels bend the action space of the lower levels in a way that aligns towards some purpose that the parts don't know anything about. And then this really takes off. But I think even simple materials have aspects of that.
Cool. So if I'm getting this right, cognition and agential behavior is about problem solving. Um,
Oh, so let me just to be clear on that, because I don't think it's all about problem solving. I focus on problem solving because that's the part that's tractable for us in the laboratory, and that's where I think we can make headway. I think
okay.
that there's a ton of other stuff around play and all these other things that are not fundamentally, I don't think, problem solving. For example, something very interesting is the search for novel problems to solve. So I think that's a meta thing, that's not actually problem solving, but that's also very important. But I focus on problem solving in most of my papers because it's hard enough to get this through to people who are used to a bottom up perspective anyway, molecular biology and such. And that's when we talk about problem solving, we can really operationalize that very tightly. We don't. If I had to try to explain what play is on the level of a cell, I'm sure that's doable at some point, and I'm sure we'll need to do that. But that's super hard. But problem solving in various spaces that we can see, like we can measure that, we can quantify it, we can. This is something that we can make progress on. So I focus on that, but I'm under no illusions that problem solving is the best paradigm to understand everything that's important.
Gotcha. But how about, so I think the word you use a lot is competency. Um, so then I guess my question would be, what defines competency? Like what defines an action as competent as opposed to incompetent?
Well, again, I don't think there are two categories. I think it's a degree. So you want to say how competent and at what. And the
Right.
most important thing about all of this is that it's observer relative. So I don't think any of these things are objective, single universal facts. I think you have to say from so what I encourage my students and everybody else to do in this field is you have a system, you make a hypothesis, you say this is the problem space I think it's working in, this is the goal I hypothesize the system is trying to reach, this is the competency I will either hypothesize or just discover when I try to put barriers between it and its goal. And now we can do experiments. Right now you can have multiple observers make multiple claims, and we can all do the empirical experiments and discover who actually had a more effective interaction with the system. So somebody will look at a model of a gene regulatory network, let's say, which is just a bunch of a small number of nodes that turn each other on and off according to ordinary differential equations. And somebody will look at it and say, well, as an observer, what do I see? Well, I see that this thing is deterministic. It's simple. There's no magic here. There's no nothing that I would recognize as cognition. I'm going to say this thing is a simple mechanical thing, and therefore, if I want to change the way it works, hardware rewiring is the way. I'm going to add nodes, remove nodes, which means gene therapy, changing promoters, things like that. Somebody else, as we did a few years ago, looked at it and said, well, I don't know. We can't assume that. Let's try something different. Let's apply stimuli and look for things that behavior scientists know, like habituation, sensitization, and so on. We did that, and we found out that they were capable of 6 different kinds of learning, including Pavlovian conditioning. And that means that you now have the opportunity to do drug conditioning and things like that in medical applications that do not require you to change the hardware at all, because they can learn in place without changing any of the physical structures. So all of this is a it's a you have to make a hypothesis first. So that's the important part of the answer to that question is I don't think you can say for sure this is what the space and the problem the domain and the goals of the system are. There will be multiple views of that, but the good news is you can find out who has better or worse perspectives by seeing how the interaction actually goes and who gets more ability to have a mutually enriching interaction with it. Sorry, I forgot the.
So, am I getting it right? So am I getting it right if I use like William James's definition of like intelligence as fixed ends achieved through variable means, and the observer makes a hypothesis about what the ends of the system are, about what the goals are, and then intervenes in a way that frustrates those goals. And the more creative the pathways the system can find back to that goal, if they were right about the hypothesis of the goal, then they've demonstrated intelligence or competency or
So, some degree of it, and I think the one really interesting part about it is that it's a two-directional IQ test. So you're testing the system, but that's only going to work out to the level that you yourself are smart and creative in figuring out what, somebody could look at a human brain and say that is an amazing paperweight, and I know what this thing can do. It will seek its lowest level in the gravitational field, and I'm going to use it to hold down my paperwork, and that's it. And somebody else will say, you completely missed it. And I think we are in that position because we have a massive degree of mind blindness, presumably because of our evolutionary firmware that we've inherited, and we fail to notice the intelligence and the cognitive capacities of I think an enormous amount of unconventional minds in our midst that we're just bad at noticing.
Totally. Awesome. So what is bioelectricity? Tell us about what your specialty is and what its mechanism, what's special about the mechanism and the molecules involved and so forth.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I'm interested in bioelectricity not because it's like it's universally special or unique. There's nothing fundamentally special about bioelectricity. The reason I'm interested in bioelectricity is as a very tractable example of cognitive glue. So I'm interested in mechanisms and policies that enable competent subunits to form larger scale collectives with competencies and other problem spaces that the parts didn't have. It turns out that bioelectricity is an amazing example of that, and so that's one reason that we focus on bioelectricity as an interface to manipulate living systems, first for useful applications, but also to understand how it is that larger scale intelligences can manifest through physical objects. So what is it? So the easiest thing to think about is bioelectricity. First of all, the most conventional, sort of well accepted common example of bioelectricity is the thing that makes each of us more than a pile of neurons. So bioelectricity is the thing that enables a brain to do things that individual neurons don't do. So the electrical network in your brain, and of course the rest of your body, is able to process information and integrate across space and time such that you end up solving problems in really interesting spaces that individual neurons don't have access to. And all you need, so knowing that basically neuroscience has been studying bioelectricity for a long time, the only other thing you need to know is that it turns out that evolution caught on to that trick of why electricity is so interesting, and I could tell you a couple of reasons why I think it is useful for that. evolution caught on to this back in the time of bacterial biofilms. It is extremely ancient, and even bacterial mats were already using bioelectricity to be more than the sum of their parts, and therefore you could ask, and all of that served as the evolutionary precursor. So it is homologous with the kinds of things that go on in our brains, and so it looks like what happened was cells were using electrical networks to coordinate their movement through anatomical space being the high dimensional space of all possible shapes that a bunch of cells could build. And later on, when nerve and muscle came on the scene, that got pivoted to a much faster information processing about moving you through three-dimensional space. So our ability to navigate three-dimensional space is an evolutionary pivot of a much older system, which was navigating you through anatomical space, starting out as a single cell embryo, ending up, whatever we end up. And that's what bioelectricity was doing. But otherwise, pretty much everything stays the same, meaning that all the ion channels that are used in your neurons, all the electrical synapses, aka gap junctions, the neurotransmitters, all of those systems are ancient. They exist in every part of your body. They're not just about brains. None of this is about brains, really. And that's what we study. So we study the electrical interface that controls how it is that your body managed to navigate from a single cell into a human target morphology, and then use that knowledge to communicate novel goals. So that means, and I can give you a bunch of examples of what we've done, but the idea is, if your brain, an animal brain mostly thinks about navigating in three-dimensional space, your somatic intelligence thinks about how to achieve and then maintain over your lifespan a particular position in anatomical space. And both of them have electrical pattern memories that we can now read out, to some extent interpret in some cases, and in those cases also to rewrite them such that that system will have different goals and will do different things that are useful for regeneration and healing.
So bioelectricity, if I'm getting this right, it's a layer that was discovered at some point in evolutionary history very early. And like, so in your view, it amplifies this competency by integrating multiple cells together, like first in a biofilm and then eventually with multicellularity.
Yeah, what it does is it scales your cognitive light cone. So as a single cell, so let's just think of this. Your cognitive light cone is the size of the biggest goals that you care about. That doesn't mean the range of your sensing. That doesn't mean the range of your activity. It means the largest goal is spatiotemporally, the largest goal that you can actively pursue. So when you're a single cell, as far as we can tell, and maybe we're missing it, but as far as we know, when you're a single cell, your goals, your cognitive light cone is tiny, meaning that all of your activities are around maintaining specific homeostatic states of gene expression, of physiology, of metabolism on the scale of that single cell. And you've got a little bit of predictive power, some minutes going forward, some memory of some minutes going backwards, and that little piece of space-time is your cognitive light cone. When that cell, and there are a number of cognitive glue mechanisms. Bioelectricity is just one of them. There's others that we found.
Okay.
But when you join into an electrical network with other cells, something really miraculous happens, and we can talk about how that happens if you want. But what happens is that you become a larger system that is able to store and pursue larger goals. So while your individual cells are really concerned with metabolic and physiological goals, a group of cells might be concerned with a grandiose construction project, making a limb. So in the case of a salamander limb, for example, right, you can amputate it at any position along the proximal distal axis, and the thing will regrow a limb. And then the most amazing part of this is it stops. It stops when the correct limb has been restored. So this is a homeostatic process. It's obviously a goal-driven process, because you can see it, because when you deviate the system from the goal, it will work its hardest to get back there, and it knows it got there because it stops. All the cells stop growing, they stop all the stuff they were doing before, and they cease activity, and they go into maintenance mode. So no individual cell in that limb knows what a finger is, or how many fingers you're supposed to have, or how big they're supposed to be, or anything like that. But the collective absolutely knows, because as long as it's got the wrong number of fingers, it will keep working really hard, spending energy doing computations to get back to the correct spot. So what allows you to focus, what allows that collective to have this kind of very large scale goal, is the fact that they're tied into to a network. Now, the electrical, obviously, also chemical, also probably biomechanical. There may be, ultra weak photon emission that is important. I don't know, but we have been kind of digging into the bioelectric glue that enables that to happen.
Gotcha. So, if I'm getting that right, um, you see morphological space, the navigation through morphological space, and the navigation through mental space or psychological space as essentially the same thing, like two pictures, two versions of the same thing, or two descriptions of the same process. Is that basically right? Or
Yeah, the empirical evidence is that they are the same space for a number of reasons. First, they use exactly the same mechanisms to navigate them. They appear to use many of the same algorithms to navigate them. I mean, we steal most of our stuff from neuroscience. The tools of neuroscience do not distinguish. So we use all the same stuff. We use optogenetics, and we use channel mutants, and we use a ton of the pharmacology, active inference, perceptual bistability, you name it. In fact, I used to have my students do this by hand, and now we have an AI thing that does it for you. You take an abstract from a neuroscience paper and you paste it in, and you can, if you just, everywhere it says neuron, you say cell, and everywhere it says millisecond, you say hour or minute, and you got yourself a developmental biology paper. The symmetry between those two fields is extreme. Once you start looking for it, it's extremely apparent. And I think that's for a very straightforward reason. It's because that is how it evolved. That's the evolutionary history of it. But yeah, I think what evolution did again and again is pivot across those spaces, from metabolic space to physiological space to gene expression space to morphous space to anatomical space to linguistic space. Who knows what. But however, I think that also all of those spaces are our attempts as observers to simplify and classify. I'm not sure that any of those spaces actually, again, have any kind of objective reality. And I'll give you a simple example. You've got a bacterium in a sugar gradient, and the bacterium wants to increase its utilization of the food, and it has a couple of options. It can move in three-dimensional space to swim up the gradient, or it can move in transcriptional space, turn on a different gene for a different enzyme that metabolizes a different sugar, and perhaps do much better. Right now, from our perspective, because of the way that we like to cut things up in science, there's the motility aspect in 3D space, and then there's the transcriptional thing, which is only beginning to be sort of recognized as spatial navigation. And those two look to us very different. To a bacterium, are those different internally? The representation of this, I have no idea, but I don't see any reason to assume it's going to be the same. So I think it's convenient for us to cut things up in that way, and it works pretty well for certain applications. But I'm not sure any of this is written in stone.
so, there was an example in your paper, and you've used it a lot of times, and Richard used it also, of the new kidney tubules. So if for those of you that don't remember this example, it's a polyploid newt. So the newt is made with like extra sets of its chromosomes, and that means that the cell size changes. And what's weird is that the newt, even though it has bigger cells, grows into a newt of a normal size. It's not like a 50% bigger newt. And so what happens is the cells adjust when they're making the kidney tubule. Instead of making it with 8 cells, they make it with 4 or 2 or even 1. And when they make it with 1, because it's like a, super polyploid newt, the cell has to do cytoskeletal bending instead of intercellular communication to make that same tubule. So it has to use a totally different mechanism. And so now I'm thinking of it through your lens of like, the mind and the body of the newt are the same thing, and morphological space is mental space. So what is that? What makes that the right solution? Like it's violated, like the inheritance which is the DNA, is has been dramatically altered. And so if the DNA carried the goals that made that the right shape, then you would suppose that that would also alter the goals, but they haven't altered. So what is it that makes that a good solution or um a good form to turn into?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, it's an example of the thing we were talking about earlier, where if you're a nude coming into this world, what can you count on? Well, you can't count on knowing how many copies of your genetic material you're going to have. You can't count on what your cell size is going to be. You can't, from other work where they drastically reduce or augment the number of cells. You can't count on the number of cells you have. You have to be able to solve your problem in the material that you've been given, which is the DNA, but also all the stuff in your cytoplasm, all the maternal factors and everything else. Is the experience of your ancestors that but you don't know or care how they got their problem solved. This you now are looking forward, right? Active agents have to look forward, and you now have to use those affordances that you have, all the different mechanisms that you have available to you to do something coherent. Now, what is it that you do? I don't think DNA at all sets the goals. I don't think I don't think evolution finds solutions to specific problems. What I think are made that way are problem solving agents. And I think there's a very strong, and again, just tying again, I wouldn't have said this a little while ago, but I think now we can start looking at things this way from the perspective of the Platonic space patterns. I think there is a very strong attractor that is saying to the material, if you can, come find me, make this is a good thing to be, see what you can do. And then there are creative ways, right? I think it's a creative problem solving task to say, given this is every IQ test, right? They give you three weird objects and they say build a whatever out of these objects, and the higher the IQ, the more weird ways you find to kind of get things done. So then it becomes a creative problem. I have these things given to me by evolution. I have no idea how they were meant to be used, and I don't care. I'm a hacker, like we all are. We just do the best we can with what we have. We don't care how it was intended to be used, and so there's a very strong pattern that calls out to the system in some way that says, if you can, this is the attractor you're going to go to. However, you can certainly push the system beyond that, and I think that's what we do when we make anthrobots or xenobots. So in the case of the xenobots, what we've done is taken some prospective epithelial cells and basically liberated them away from the rest of the cells, which normally tell them what to do. And so now there's no hope of them assembling a full embryo because they're missing the endoderm and the mesoderm. There's no way they're going to make the full embryo. What are you going to do? How are you going to be a functional organism in the world when you can't do that? So it turns out they find a different way to do it. The different way has a different morphology. It has different transcriptome with about 900 different transcripts that normal embryos don't drive. They have all kinds of new capacities, as you'll see in the new preprint that we just put up. They can react to sound now, where normal embryos don't do that. They upregulate a bunch of hearing related genes. Now we've made it impossible for them to reproduce in the normal froggy fashion. They can't do any of that. But if you give them loose skin cells, they will do kinematic self-replication. They will gather these skin cells into a little ball and sort of shape it, and then that thing becomes the next generation of xenobots, and it goes out and do the same thing. No other creature on Earth, to our knowledge, does that. That was not in their history, again, to our knowledge. So why I bring that up is that in the nude case, I think that there is a sense in which that nude shape is a really good thing to do if you're at all similar to nude to parts. But if you can't go there, there are plenty of other ways to be. And that's why with a standard genome, right? So the xenobot has a completely standard frog genome. The anthrobot has a completely standard human genome. And the anthrobot, you would never recognize it or its behaviors as having anything to do with humans unless you sequence the genome and you said, well, why is this Homo sapiens? So I think there are the variety of things that living material can turn into is massive, but it's also pretty good at doing the same thing if possible, whenever possible.
So the xenobots experiment is just one of the coolest experiments that's ever been done, and I think it's amazing, and I think everyone admires that experiment. But I really have a hard time interpreting what you're saying about it because when I hear you say kinematic self-replication, and I hear you say it's trying to form a coherent organism, um, I hear survival and reproduction is what I hear. Like I hear that evolution has handed this xenobot because it's made of agential material or because of I'm not sure why evolution has handed it the goal of survival and reproduction. And even though it finds itself in this totally novel morphology, what it's actually trying to do is survive and reproduce itself, even though it's in this novel morphology. And to me, that's puzzling. So how could evolution hand it that goal, um, as opposed to what I would think of as a purely cognitive goal of like exploring the world and trying to understand it.
Okay, so this is all very much a work in progress, and this is stuff that Richard and I and Adam and I talk about all the time and try to get to the bottom of. But for sure, what I don't think at this point is that evolution hands down specific goals. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that we can make some hypotheses. I could venture some guesses as to what the underlying imperatives might actually be. But I don't think that's what evolution is handing down. And this probably goes to the last thing, the point seven, whatever that you want to talk about, which
Yeah,
is
yeah, and
what.
then I'm going to shut up and let everyone else ask their questions and talk too.
Well, what I suspect, I think first of all that mostly, if not entirely, it's not driven by the physical embodiments that we see as products of evolution. I think what evolution ends up making, again, are problem-solving agents, and what that really means is they are progressively better and better at resonating with specific patterns in the Platonic space of ways to be. And some of those patterns are very simple things. The rules about prime numbers and whatever, which guides morphomechanics and things like that. And some of these patterns are very high agency things that we would recognize as kinds of minds. And I think what's happening here is a continuous feedback, a positive feedback loop, where evolution benefits a lot from exploiting these free lunches that it gets from this Platonic space, meaning that constraints and enablements that it does not have to micromanage. Facts of mathematics and computation that just are. They're not things that you need to evolve and so on. And so it benefits from them tremendously. But what that means is that it's able to then produce better pointers, and I think that's what physical bodies are. Whether embryos, whether biobots, whether computers, whatever, anything we make is fundamental. The physical part is not where the action is. I don't think. I think the physical part is a pointer or an interface to some number of patterns from this space. And I think there's this positive feedback loop where basically by offering evolution these free lunches, you're canalizing it to go to do things that enable it to pull down yet more patterns, which again, right? So I think what's actually driving all of this is some kind of we don't have a great vocabulary for this. The people have proposed terms for this, but I worry about using them because I don't know that that's what these classical thinkers actually thought. So I'm not going to take a chance. But basically, what I think is driving all this is some kind of outward pressure from these patterns that want to, but I think that's actually a good word here, ingress into the physical world by resonating with the pointers that are made by us or by evolution. And that's what's happening here. It's driven, I think, mostly from that side. So yeah, I don't think evolution is what hands it down, but it's an important component of producing those interfaces, which capture some of these things.
Okay, so just to like put a finer point on it, um, is cognition a tool used by inheritance for its purposes, or is inheritance a tool of cognition? In other words, like an extension of memory.
I mean, I think they go hand in hand. I put more emphasis on the cognition part, and I think that I don't think it's like the standard story of evolution where it's a selection from random variants. I don't think that's a sufficiently rich way of looking at this whole thing. But I think what's happening is that I mean, one thing we can say for sure is that if you run evolution over an agential substrate, it works completely differently. So here we've actually done a bunch of work on simulations of this. So we have some results where typically the way people model this is they have the genotype and they have the phenotype. So you got your genome, then it's got the genome is the target of mutations, then you've got the phenotype, which is what gets selected on, and there's some, and that's it. There's usually a fairly straightforward mapping between those two, right? That those are the two things you have. Then you have some more sophisticated things where people say, well, there's some development in the middle that provides pleiotropy, and it provides redundancy, and it provides degeneracy and all these things. And so it's complex. The relationship between the genotype and the phenotype is very complicated. And then you do your evolutionary research. I think what actually happens is that middle layer, it isn't just complex. It's actually, it is actually intelligent in the sense that it's a problem solving agent that receives the genome as a prompt, as inputs. And then it has certain affordances that it can do. It receives also these patterns from the Platonic space also as inputs, and then it does its best, and then you get your phenotype. So what happens when you try to evolve over that material is something very interesting. Imagine for a moment that so we know it's the case where if you have a tadpole and you artificially scramble its craniofacial organs, the eyes on the side of the head, the mouth is on top, everything's right. Mr. Potato Head, everything's scrambled. Right. Well, what you get from that,
Picasso tadpole.
Picasso tadpoles, exactly. So what you get from that is a normal frog, right? The everything kind of moves around in novel paths, and you get your normal frog. So now imagine during evolution what happens under a direct mapping. You have some mutation. Mutations always do multiple things. So that mutation, it does something good somewhere in the animal. It also moves the mouth off to the side. Well, under a straightforward mapping, the animal can't eat because the mouth is off, and evolution never gets to explore the other effects of the mutation. So you will have to wait. Evolution has to wait until it finds a mutation that only does the good thing and doesn't screw up this other stuff, right? But in reality, because of that self-fixing layer, that's all right. The mouth will come back to where it needs to be. The animal will eat, and whatever else that mutation did gets to be explored. So a bunch of mutations that before were deleterious become neutral, right, and become part of the exploration space. Now, there's an issue though, which is that when that tadpole comes up for selection sees a pretty good tadpole. But what it doesn't know is, was the structural genome good, and that's why the tadpole looks good, or was the competency good, and actually the genome wasn't very good at all. It just kind of fixed everything. So what happens then is, as soon as you start hiding information, and this is our computational results, as soon as you start hiding information from selection, what you find is that the pressure on the actual genome starts to let off, but the pressure comes on to the actual competency part. And that's a feedback loop, because the minute you do that, then that becomes even harder. You have more competency, and that makes it even harder to know for selection, to know what the heck happened to the, what is the quality of the genome. It's a little bit like, there's a cool example that Steve Frank told me, that when people started making RAID arrays, where you have multiple hard drives, right, and you're sort of interleaving them so that you don't lose data. When people started making RAID arrays, the quality of disk media went down, because there was no longer much pressure on making sure that each of your disks is actually high quality. You can just, if everybody has a RAID, then it's fine, and it doesn't matter. And of course, the problem is you can't go backwards, right? If you remove the RAID, now you're screwed. So anyway, when you track the pressure, what happens is you get this feedback loop, which basically means that the more competency in your system you have, the more evolution tends to crank on the competency mechanisms. And then you can imagine that different organisms ended up at different positions of it. So you have, on the left side of that spectrum, you have things like C. elegans, nematodes, which, they have very little plasticity. Every cell is numbered. Every C. elegans has exactly the same number of cells doing the exact same thing. They're like cookie cutter stamped out, organisms. On the right side of it, you have something like planaria. Planaria are nuts, and I only realized that this is what it always bothered me for years, for decades. Actually, it bothered me that planaria are immortal, incredibly regenerative. You can cut them into hundreds of pieces, cancer resistant, extremely cancer resistant, and because they reproduce by tearing themselves in half and regenerating, they don't shed all their somatic mutations the way that we do, anything that doesn't kill a stem cell gets amplified into the next generation, which is why their cells, if you look at their cells, they're mixoploid. In other words, they can have different number of chromosomes. So they're kind of like a tumor. They're like the genetics are incredible, an incredible mess. So this always drove me crazy. Why is the animal with the messiest genome the one that is cancer resistant, ageless, and regenerative? It doesn't make any sense. And finally, we realized that that's probably what's going on in these planaria. All the work, because their substrate was so unreliable, because evolution had to lean into this fact that, yeah, you're going to not only get mutated, you're going to keep all your mutations. You can't really trust much of what your genetics are doing. You basically it just cranked that positive feedback loop all the way to the right, where everything went into making an algorithm that can form a perfect worm even when the underlying hardware is crap. And it explains two very puzzling facts that no one else seems to have an explanation for, which is one, that people have been trying to make transgenic planaria since the late 80s, and it's never been done. People put in transgenes the way, you could put transgenes into all kinds of stuff. Planaria, there are no transgenic planaria. Nobody could understand why. And I think it's because they don't take their own genome that seriously, and they're certainly not going to take your added engineered plasmids very seriously. They already assume that all that stuff is going to be unreliable. And the other thing is, every other animal, at least model species, you can call the stock setter and you can get mutant lines. So you can say, I want to fly with the curly wings, or I want a mouse with, funky, eyes or whatever. There are no mutant lines of planaria. There are only normal planaria. And then there are two abnormal lines, which we made, and they're not genetic. They're the bioelectrically induced double-headed and the cryptic form that are kind of confused about how many heads they're supposed to have. But that's it. There are no, and I think, again, this is why. Because, and by the way, this is so take this with a grain of salt, because this is not published and peer reviewed. We haven't published this yet, but we did experiments where we kept planaria. We grew them in mutagen, the kind of mutagen where, for a zebrafish or Drosophila, you sort of dip it in for 10 minutes and then you get your mutant screen and you get all these crazy forms. Yeah, we kept them in there for over a year, and we never recovered anything. I mean, they would make some weird growths and stuff, and then you cut them and you're back to normal planaria. So it just proved completely impossible to shift them off of that in the traditional way. So all of that is to say that I think cognition, and in the sense of this kind of adaptive problem solving, makes a massive difference to how evolution operates, both the scale and the fact that it can't make fixed solutions, because everything is going to change. Not just the environment is going to change, but your own parts are going to change. You're going to mutate. And if you really take that seriously, the way that the planarian lineages have, you just you put all your effort into the computational process of figuring out, how am I going to be an organism, when I can't really rely on all of these things. And then, of course, that obviously opens 29 other questions about how it works and whatever. And, this is the kind of stuff that we study.
Yeah. So just one last thing, and then I'll be quiet and let everyone else jump in. So if I'm understanding you right, when I hear you say evolution turns the crank on competency mechanisms, and in the case of planaria, it's not turning the crank on the genome, because it can't really see the genome, because the competency mechanism is sort of in the way of selection. It's like interfering with the pressure that would otherwise go to the genome, because it's making a phenotype independent of what the genes, may or may not contribute to that phenotype. When I hear you say that it's turning the crank on it, I think the way you're answering the question is that cognition is a tool of inheritance.
I would put it the other way, because ultimately, I mean, what do I, okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. What do I mean when I say it's turning the crank? Because somebody else is going to say, well, but all those competency mechanisms still have to be encoded by proteins, so ultimately it's just going to be the genes anyway, right? That would be the conventional way of looking at it. I think fundamentally what's going on here is this: you can commit to improving the mechanisms which micromanage or directly implement specific things, the way that C. elegans does. C. elegans has a very hardwired set of relationships that are going to happen between the genes and between the cells. So you can try to sculpt all of that, or you can again, this absolutely relates to the shape and composition of the physical body. I mean, you can't get away from it. But what you can do instead of trying to nail down all the particulars is you can make an architecture that's really good at picking up patterns, at exploiting these patterns from the Platonic space. And that's what I think when I say it's cranking on the competency mechanism. That's what I think it's doing. I think it's found, and by the way, you know, we don't know all. In fact, probably most of what that actually entails. This is what we're researching. But I think that different embodiments have different degrees with which they can resonate with specific patterns. And what you can do is try to brute force it, or yourself, which would take a long time, and you end up with something like C. elegans, which is successful in certain niches, but doesn't have the plasticity of planaria. Or you can say, I'm going to make a more general purpose receiver, I don't interface, which is going to be better at letting that pattern come through, even when other things around it change. It's going to, you know, I'm sure there's some electronics analogy about you know, how much the rest of your electronics is or is not affecting the ability of your inductor to pick up certain frequencies. I don't know. This was probably some visualization there, but that's what I think is happening. Is do you try to, and just like we with engineering, you can try to micromanage stuff, or you can try to take advantage of the free lunches, so to speak.
Cool. Mike, thank you so much for submitting to that intense barrage of questions. Now, I'm just going to open it up to the rest of the group. And I think Wayne's had his hand up for quite some time. So take it away, Wayne.
Hey, Wayne.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry. I'll try to unmute you. Wayne, yeah, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm dying. I'm good. Can you everybody hear me?
Great.
First, thanks a lot, Mike, for you know, for taking the time to speak to our little group here. I'm super familiar with Mike's work. Like, I've read just about everything, listened to pretty much all the talks, all the podcasts. So I don't have really that many questions. It was more like kind of comments. So when we were, you know, so we're talking about, you know, why does the organism want to develop the way it does? On the one hand, I think if you start with developmental systems theory and just sort of the recreation of a robust but flexible life cycle, you know, and you get a preset bias, which includes, of course, genetic material, but it also includes things like the inherent bioelectric patterning that's going to come, developmental niche, various RNAs and DNAs and other molecules in the ovum, and what Jasper Hoffmeyer would have called the semiotic scaffolding, and this is all to say the contexts in which, you know, the organism is going to develop, and they tend to bias it towards this pattern that's been there before. But as Mike pointed out, a lot of other patterns are possible given the right contexts or the right prompts. You know, but Charlie's question was about, well, why does it do this in the first place? Is it really about inheritance? Is it really about cognition? And the way I see it, I think it's going to be a lot more clear after we talk to Matt Segal, maybe either in May or in June. And it's, you know, and I don't have obviously any empirical evidence for this. This is more philosophical, because I'm really not sure how you would do an experiment on this sort of thing. But, you know, why create these problem-solving machines? You know, essentially, why does evolution driven to do this? And I kind of like Whitehead's point of view. You know, so which sort of requires a pan-experientialist point of view. But that is that the universe is driving at novelty, exploring itself in new ways, and this is one of the fundamental drives that's in all matter, and also in possibility space, which is this Platonic space that Mike's talking about, which is really sort of the space of possibilities. And if you take that space as part of reality, rather than think of it as something abstract that only matter is reality, you get some really satisfying results, even in fundamental physics. But anyway, I don't have any particular question just because I'm very familiar with Mike's work and I'm up on it. So I'll turn it over to other folks. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I do not think the only or even the best way to envision this as physical agents that search for or benefit from these patterns. I think we can flip it, and I think we have to flip it as looking at it from the point of view of the patterns themselves and their motivations for interacting with physical interfaces. And you know, and you mentioned how to do experiments. So this actually does have a pretty specific experimental implications, because at least we found a couple of scenarios where that's true. Think of the problem of aging. Okay, so our group works on among other things on aging, and there's a couple of things that are relevant here. We used to think of it mostly as, much like in embryogenesis, the ability of cells to hold together a coherent organism as cells come and go and material comes and goes is driven in part by these bioelectrical patterns, and that maybe over time that what aging is a disruption of these patterns over time. Okay, and so again, this is the idea that right. So the question is, which is the data and which is the machine, right? Who's the you know, are the patterns the agents, or is the physical machine the agent? So from that perspective, it's the passive data that need to be reinforced, and then you know, the machine will be great. And so there's some work that we've done on that, and that's an approach that actually works pretty well for fixing birth defects and things like that. But there's a different approach, which you could say, actually you could flip it, and you could say the patterns of data on that Turing tape, even though, I mean, I realize none of this is actually captured by Turing models, but just for the purposes of this, it's the patterns in the data that are actually driving the machine, and anything that happens to the machine is like a stigmergic scratch pad in the world. It's, you know, we're looking at the machine because that's what we like to look at, but the patterns in the data are the boss. They're the ones that are driving it, and everything we see, it's like tracking the pheromones and the sand particles around an ant colony, right? It's like that's the physical consequences of the algorithms of ant swarm intelligence and so on. So if you look at it that way, you might say that, wait a minute, maybe the patterns are actually fine. Maybe the problem is that the machine is sluggish, and the physical medium in which these patterns are trying to have their life becomes less and less capable of supporting the things that they want to do. And that's a completely different, I mean, those are experimentally distinguishable scenarios, and we're now doing some of that work to say whether actually maybe the problem is the patterns are actually fine, the machine isn't keeping up, and it's not enabling the interaction of those patterns like they should. And those lead to very different therapeutic therapeutic pipelines. So that's just an example of where the different perspectives lead to different things.
Yeah, I saw some recently that you I thought there may be a preprint, but I haven't read it yet. Where you're thinking about aging, and you know, the proposal is that perhaps if you can give the apparatus new problems to become interested in and new problems to solve, you slow down or potentially reverse the aging process. Was that right?
That's a whole other thing. That too. That's
a really interesting.
That's a different preprint that basically says that aging is neither a cause of inevitable accumulation of errors, nor an evolutionary programmed strategy, but rather basically it's in one word, it's boredom. It's what you have as a cognitive system that has completed its goal and doesn't know what to do anymore. It's lost its you know, the purpose that bound the parts together, and it fragments. And so that's a there's this computational work in that one. We have another one coming probably in a couple of weeks that has actually some data on this showing how it actually works in tissues. So but that's a whole other thing.
I mean, just, you know, given the plasticity and the robustness of the cognitive system itself, you know, just sort of like the breakdown and the fact that, you know, material is constantly recycling, that doesn't really, this idea actually makes a lot more intuitive sense. Of course, you have to get data on it.
Yeah.
at least for me.
I mean, one very, so this is a really weird analogy, but I was just tell you this story anyway. Just imagine for a second that you know, you and your pet snake end up in the Judeo-Christian version of heaven, right? So everything is great, every day is perfect.
Yeah,
There is no noise, right? There's no noise, there's no damage, everything is great. Maybe the snake will be fine for an infinity of years. Every day is the same as every other day, doing snake things. Maybe there's no problem. I don't know. But for a human, I mean, my intuition is that a human cognition, you'll keep yourself busy for the first 10,000 years, but like a couple of billion years out, are you still sane? Is it possible for a cognitive system to, without changing, without radically restructuring itself, you know, the caterpillar is some kind of caterpillar butterfly thing, is it possible to stay sane without some sort of in the same configuration without new goals? And I have a feeling that basically, so what that story is getting at is that some things are not caused by damage or design. They might be caused by, again, these kind of fundamental limitations, almost like a, you know, the kind of thing like a girdle result, right? Like there's not a physical problem that causes, you know, girdling, you know, limitations or halting, whatever. It's not it's not a physical problem. It's a fundamental nature of what it means to be a cognitive or a being. And then that leads to the question. So as a longevity therapeutic, is it enough to remind the system of the original goal and say, well, you know, it's still good to be this human, you know, do that. Is that going to work? Or is that actually impossible? And the only way to keep going is to radically change your embodiment. So we're talking about some sort of transhumanism where you can't have 1,000 years in a standard human body, but you can have as you know, every 100 years you do a butterfly thing and you're something else, right? And that kind of refreshes the system. So the jury's still very much open on that. We're kind of exploring those things. I don't know, but the idea that the limitation there is not a material limitation nor an evolutionary limitation. It's a cognitive, fundamentally a cognitive problem.
Awesome. Rafe?
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating.
Rafe?
So Michael, I'm curious, like, what's the relationship, if any, between the platonic attractors that you're talking about and morphogenetic fields? And then there's like a kind of a second part I'm curious about. Do you see John Holland's work on signals and boundaries here fitting in, and if so, how?
Right. Let's see. Well, the first one. So when we talk about morphogenetic fields, it depends what you mean. So there are let's broadly classify them. There are morphogenetic fields that people refer to that are physical fields. In other words, chemical gradients of morphogens, which are chemical kinds of things. There are bioelectrical fields which we can see and measure more or less directly. And then there are these weird things, like, for example, Darcy Thompson in his 1920, I think, book on growth and form, that my favorite, it's an amazing book. It has some awesome stuff in it. My favorite are the 4 or 5 pages where what he shows is that if you take a Cartesian grid and you put an animal on it, and he shows it with skulls and crabs and a bunch of fish and a bunch of stuff. And then what you do is you mathematically deform that grid. Okay, so you do these conformal deformations where you kind of stretch the grid. You end up with this other, of course, the shape changes, but you end up with other existing species of animals. And people have talked about that kind of stuff as also as a morphogenetic field, but it's different to some extent than the conventional fields, because it has no known material implementation. Right? Nobody can tell you really what that grid. I mean, what the heck is that grid in terms of when you start looking for BMP proteins or whatever, you're not going to find that grid. So what's the what's the relationship? So I think it's something like when you have let's just go to something simple like Turing patterns. When you have Turing patterns that make specific shapes, or when you make or in a bioelectrical circuit, same thing. You get symmetry breaking, and you get very characteristic kinds of shapes that we've simulated. I think what you have there is what mathematicians always have, which is you have a pointer that points to a complex structure, that then shapes what that pointer actually does in the real world, much like those fractals that I had in the Platonic space paper. You have, a tiny little seed, 6 characters that encode the formula in Z, and then it makes this like amazing, thing. Where is that stuff? It isn't anywhere in the physical world. So I think that's what's happening here is basically that these are that the physical fields are a good interface to these patterns, where again, as always happens in these cases, you get more out than you put in. So the thing you put in is a fairly simple prompt or pointer, and the thing that actually pulls down has a ton of structure that is, you can't explain by pre-existing codes in the physical world.
I mean, just to be clear, I was referring to the more Sheldrake sense, the bridge between the esoteric and the material.
I see.
So-
Okay. Well, yeah, I got it. Well, this is, I mean, the thing about here's what I can say about that. The most interesting thing about Rupert's proposal is that what he's actually saying is that it's not a one-way relationship, that it's not just that these patterns are influencing things that happen in the real world, but actually there's some kind of habituation where things that happen in the physical world feed back on and reinforce certain patterns in that space. I mean, I don't know whether that's the case. If I had to put down $10 right now, I would say probably it is. I don't have any evidence for it. I think that the reason I don't talk about it in our work is because I don't have any way of getting at it right now. At some point, like, it's an important thing to sort of cogitate about. It's, at some point it might be important. I don't think there's anything we can do with it right now. I don't think we have any way of it isn't tractable, I think, to real experiment. Now Rupert's got obviously some evidence from things he describes in his books, which is great, but it doesn't give me enough purchase on things that we can do to take the thing forward. So I kind of don't know, but I like the idea, and I do think that probably it is bi-directional. I probably is.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. And the other part was about signals and boundaries, John Holland.
Yeah, tell me more about that. So I know John Holland, but what's the signals and boundaries thing?
Well, he was saying that signals and boundaries are the fundamental building blocks of complex adaptive systems, or intelligent agents, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, that's hard to argue with, I guess. Boundaries for sure. Critical, different kinds of boundaries, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems right. It seems that to be a significant agent, you have to make a model of certain kinds of boundaries of things that you can control, for example, and things you can't control, or degrees of control or whatever, and thus you end up with a self model. The things that you can control are mostly you, and so on, at least to some extent. So yeah, I mean, it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is, it's just in the engineering context, it would be good to know the lexicon, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. We have, I think we've learned a bunch of things from our study of the biological case around what it would take to engineer things ourselves that have these properties, and I absolutely think we can. I don't think there's a magic material. I don't think that evolution has any monopoly on on making minds. I absolutely think, I don't think anything makes minds. I think you facilitate interaction with mind. But I think that's a whole other thing. If anybody wants to talk about is kind of some of the ethical questions around embodying things that we really don't understand at all yet. And so, I think we want to be careful there.
Well, I thank you. I'll just end by saying I'd love to have that discussion at some other time, anytime.
Cool. Thanks, Ray.
Awesome. Kate.
Hey, Kate.
Hey,
Good to see you.
yeah, always good. I'm always accused of being the fire hose, but you are amazing. Let's see. I'd like to build on what Rafe said a little bit about identity boundaries. I've read all your lovely stuff on the self, and I think that that is a fundamental question, particularly the question of self-reference. And I've been thinking, talking with Luke Hoffman about the laws of form. And I'm completely on board that the mathematics, different pattern making activities that are happening between what you're calling the Platonic realm and what we're calling our daily workaday realm. You're familiar with Stu's context of res potentia and res extensa. I really like that, and I'm building a story of the sort of the interaction that you just said Rupert Sheldrake is suggesting, because I do think that right at the interface, and I'm taking liberties with your light cone and your bow tie model as the interface, this flow of information between the two domains. So what Luke Hoffman, I guess what I'm getting at with mathematics is that I think you said something a minute ago that I either misperceived or projected about Gödel and about how Gödel's incompleteness is part of the story. Because that's a kind of a conclusion that I'm coming to too. And the central problem that Gödel ran into was paradox, self-referential paradox. So when you put that together with Luke Hoffman and what's his name, Charles Spencer Spears's laws of form, because you're talking about patterns where on either side, but when you're talking about patterns in the Platonic realm, there really is some aspect, some attractor that calls to the self to be that, to become that, right? So the fundamental act of what they call a distinction, meaning that there's nothing there, and then there's a fundamental act of a distinction that makes a mark. And at the moment that that mark is made, it distinguishes a background and a foreground, because distinction is the mark, but it also distinguishes a background. So you have right there both an object and a subject and an object in one mathematical distinction. And it's self-referential. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with Luke Hoffman's work, but I think he's really onto something there with this idea of self-reference, because to me, and you know, I study the emotional system, and I've been thrilled that you've come up with an entire new layer of bioelectric stimulus that gives rise to the emotional experience. So, but it's the difference between emotion as a process and cognition, which I think is a very important distinction to make, that these problem-solving capacities you're talking about, and you're calling them cognition, but coming from clinical psychology, there's a little bit of an entanglement between the concept of cognition and the context of sentience, because you have sensory input, which is the kind of physics that you're talking about, and chemistry. That's the sensory, and it's the stimulus, the real stuff, right? The computation is whatever, the cognition is whatever work is done on it to give rise to a response. So I argue that the emotion piece came way before, and that it's valenced. So and so everything about the difference between emotion and cognition proper is that emotion is all about the self. This is Joseph Ledoux's work, but it's completely embodied, and it's a coarse graining of the kind of intelligence that you're associating with the cell. And I completely agree with that. So my underlying question for you is, what is the role of self-reference in identity, in creating a boundary structure? Because even parts and wholes assume some kind of boundary relationship. And I think that we get at what that dance of parts and wholes is and how that works in terms of identity is where we're really going to make some progress. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah, super interesting. So one thing is we actually, Susan Stepney and a bunch of others and I are writing a thing specifically focused on self-reference. So at some point that will come out. There's some really interesting questions there. I I don't know much here. I think that I could say something like this. Because of this very observer-centered perspective that we've been developing with Josh Bongard and Chris Fields and whatever, one can say that the boundaries of a particular self are in the eyes of an observer. That is, multiple different observers who are observing a system could draw those boundaries very differently, and so on a first pass, that sounds insufficient because that kind of means that we're not really real. We're some kind of figment in other observers' imagination. But I think that the way that I think about it is that systems will also have a view of themselves, and they become what kind of like what Hofstadter calls a strange loop, right? It's like a trefoil knot kind of thing, or some kind of knot that basically holds itself together, so that yes, other observers can have other perspectives, and they can interact with parts of you or parts with you plus something else as another system. But you've got your own view of what you are, and this the other kind of crazy thing I can say about that is I think what really holds that together are in an important way are stories. And what I mean by that is let's look at an embryo. So you have a blastoderm of I don't know 100,000 cells, and you look at that and you say, oh, there's an embryo. Well, what are you counting when you say that's one embryo? There's 1,000 cells. What is there one embryo of?
Exactly.
Well, right. What you're really counting is the fact that all of those cells they've all bought into the same story of where they're going to go in anatomical morphospace. They all agree on what the correct outcome is going to be, and they're all going to work together to do that. So one interesting thing you can do is you can take a little I used to do this in duck embryos, for example. You can take a needle, you can put some scratches in that blastoderm, and what will happen for the next 4 to 8 hours is that each of the little islands that you've just created doesn't feel the presence of the others, and they self-organize an embryo on their own, and then it'll sort of heal up, and you've got triplets and quadruplets and whatever. They're all facing in different ways, but within each one, all the cells are completely aligned. But now there's multiple individuals. So it's super interesting that the embryo you actually start out with is not one being. It is some sort of excitable medium or a potential field from which could come 0, 1, or up to probably almost a dozen other individuals. And this is where twins and triplets and things come from in humans as well. So the question of how many beings are inside an embryo is not obvious at all. It is certainly not set by genetics. It is determined by to what extent do all of the cells agree on a story of what they're about to do, and maintain that story against various perturbations and whatnot. So I think there's something very interesting there. Alignment, like the cells are literally physically aligned because of planar cell polarity. They have to actually physically get aligned, but more importantly, they're aligned with respect to goals in this anatomical space. So we could say that these kind of stories are what hold individuals together and define the boundaries of the individual, because we literally have, like one thing I published, as a grad student, was this paper on why conjoined twins, both human and animal conjoined twins, one of the twins often has laterality defects, like the heart will be confused or whatever. Why is that? Well, because what happens is you have two embryos sitting together like this, and there's a bunch of cells over here that have to decide, wait a minute, am I the left side of this guy or am I the right side of this guy? And they have a difficulty doing that because it isn't obvious, right? When there's two individuals there, it's not obvious who you belong to, and sometimes the way that decision, and it's stochastic, and sometimes the way that decision goes, one of the twins is going to have two right sides or something like that. So one thing we could say is that those boundaries are determined by the stories that they buy into, or you could go further and you could say that the stories are the individuals, and everything else that the physical evidence of it, the physical manifestations that we all spend our time looking at under the microscope, are just the sort of consequences. They're the stigmergic, pheromone traces on the ground after the ants have done their thing. So I don't know, I don't know which way is more useful. You can take your pick, but I think that's what's going on with these boundaries.
Can I do a real quick follow-up? I don't want to bogart you, but what I'm hearing you say is that boundaries are permeable and dynamic, and that at the very no, let me add a little to that. The very lowest level, identity is both a part and a whole. Does that make sense? And that it has a story about itself as a whole, like I am an electron and I'm always going to be an electron. I'm going to have behavior that puts me at my optimal space of who I am, my least action, least energy. But at the same time, I am part of an atom. So therefore, I am both a part and a whole. And it is resonance between my song, I saw Richard here, my song as a whole, and my song as a part of a greater whole. So to me, when you're talking about patterns in the Platonic realm that have okay, this is where Lou Coffin's topology is really beautiful, because you can get self-reference, and when something completes itself, all that stuff. But that at that deepest level, there's always a me and a we, if you will, in the self story. And when you follow that line of thinking all the way up, you do see these dynamic self boundaries, and it connects completely with a lot of the higher level stuff of that identity, personal identity. And in fact, Daniel Siegel has come up with the word MWE, MWE, and that describes the optimal experience of human beings in a connection, like in a relationship, because your geometry is your fundamental, if you will, and your geometry as a whole, as connected to someone else, is your harmonic. So I think that there's a really beautiful story there. And thank you for everything you've done to help tease out and ask the important questions about identity in particular.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Just two quick things to mention that are maybe relevant to that. One is about the electrons and everything. One of my favorite parts of chemistry is that most of it works because there are kind of bond where the electrons are delocalized, and neither atom, basically they kind of each atom sort of thinks it's his electron, right? And there aren't actually enough electrons, but that's okay because they're delocalized to the point where you actually can't say which one it belongs to, and that's enough to make the thing stable and to make chemistry work. I always thought that's incredible, right? It's sort of the ignorance, in a way, the fact that you can't actually tell which thing is which, that for some reason makes actual matter stable, and makes chemistry possible. I always thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing about boundaries, here's a quick example where we can actually watch the battle of worldviews happen in an embryo. You have a frog embryo, and we inject somewhere in the flank. We inject some ion channel RNA, which puts the cells in a particular voltage state that basically it recreates the little spot that creates eyes in the head. Okay, it's a little spot of voltage pattern that creates. So then here's what happens. Those cells, and we've done this, if you inject only a few cells, they somehow can tell that there's not enough of them to make a proper eye. So what do? They try to convince their neighbors to join them. And it's what a lot of good collective intelligences do. When ants find something heavy that they can't lift, what do? They recruit a bunch of other ants. So you see this when it works and it makes an eye, you section that eye and you see that only a few of the cells actually got injected by us. The rest of them, we never touched them. They were completely normal cells, but they were instructed, right? So, okay, however, it doesn't always work. Why doesn't it always work? Because there's a cancer suppression mechanism at play where all the cells are constantly saying to their neighbors, wait a minute, you've got a weird voltage. You're on your way to transformation, that you got to cut that out. And what they do is they try to, by using their gap junctions, they try to normalize any of this weird voltage such that the whole thing stays skin or whatever. And so what you see is actually, and then you can, it's actually dynamic. Sometimes you can see the some of the eye relevant genes come on and then they get wiped out and there is no eye because the other cells won. The other cells are saying you should be skin, but knock off whatever weird thing you're doing. You should be skin, and they're literally trying to normalize the voltage to make it go back to what it should be for that area. And the other cells are saying, no, you need to help. You need to help us make an eye. You're going to be a retina, and they go back and forth. And sometimes the one wins, and sometimes the other wins. But if you are, but the interesting thing is that always involves a resetting of boundaries, because if you're going to stay skin, you've got this massive boundary that's, you're this giant layer. If you're going to be an eye, you need to distinguish yourself. And there's going to be a border, right? The eye is a very particular size and they're incredibly finicky about their size. We've never, despite all the crazy things we've done, we've never actually managed to make an eye that's bigger than normal. We still don't know how to crack that. But what it will absolutely do is make a border. And within that border, everybody agrees we're an eye. And as soon as you leave that border, we're tail skin. And it's the result of that battle of what should we be and where should our border be, right? And I think if we manage to decode how all of that works, I mean, we know some of it, but not enough. If we actually manage to decode some of that stuff, that's where a lot of these open questions are gonna, I think, crack open, and certainly applications as well.
That's awesome. Thank you. I just want to say one last thing. It sounds like what you're describing is in the complexity language. You have networks that operate on simple rules, your algorithmic rules, and nearest neighbor information. And what you just described is this sort of battle where that each node is feeling peer pressure to join into the collective whole. And I think that's really deep and beautiful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, and stay tuned. I'm hoping in about a month we have a pretty cool project on the cellular automata and using them as a model system for unexpected, let's say unexpected competencies. I'll just put it that way. So we'll see how that develops.
That's great. Are you familiar with Wolfram's work? C. Wolfram, the Platonic realm is what he calls a Ruliad. And he does this beautiful work on observer theory, where he talks about both a mathematical observer and a physical observer. I'm going to put this together in a story, so stay tuned.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great. I'm slowly and painfully trying to catch up on all of Stephen's stuff. They're incredibly prolific, so it's taken me a while to.
I just look at observer theory. It's pretty powerful. Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, Mike. If I may, I just would like to ask you if you don't think that human thought could have a role as a evolutionary force, meaning that thoughts and behavior are epigenetic modulator, and what we think and how we act as shape our neurobiology and influences also future generation. And it seems that when it comes to us as human, there is a push to increase our brain's computational ability, moving towards threshold that maybe we could understand the fundamental structure of reality, both physical and informational, and use thought as a tool to make existential choices. And so maybe the ultimate evolutionary direction could be to take the decision to be wave or mass, meaning once intelligence reaches the full computational maturity, human maybe gain the ability to choose to remain material form, mass body existence, or to transition in a information wave-based existence.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, except that I don't think it's just humans. I mean, really, I don't know what humans are anyway. We can have a discussion about what's a human, what's not a human, but I do think that thought in general has that potential. One of the coolest examples in cell biology where this is studied is Oded Rachavi's work. So Oded is a member of our Allen Center that works in Israel, and he's got some really cool examples of he works in C. elegans and nematode and looking at transgenerational inheritance of behavioral experience, and it's amazing work. So I think it goes all the way down. You know, I think that I'm not sure if you know, sort of standard modern humans have some kind of a special leg up on this. I mean, it's possible, but I think it's a much more generic it's a generic scenario, and we already kind of know that. I mean, it's basic voluntary motion. You know, when you get up in the morning, because you have very high level abstract career goals, whatever. In order for you to go do that, ions have to flow across your muscle membranes, right? So we already know that there's some I mean, bioelectrically mediated transduction of these very abstract thought patterns into making the electrons dance across cell membranes. So the biochemistry is driven by this stuff, literally. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see that those same kinds of things affecting mechanisms that we see as heredity. You know, the things about.
But Michael, when you were describing the bioelectric field and describing what a bioelectric field is related to one cell or a group of cells, could this explain a shift in evolutionary trajectory from pure survival to computation?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not sure it's about pure survival in the first place. You know, these patterns. I'm more and more inclined to put the agency on the Platonic end, which means that they don't have a survival problem. They're not going anywhere. You know, that's not the issue. What is it? You know, what is the issue is an interesting question. You know, is it exploration? Is it self knowledge? Is it, you know, people have said all these grandiose things. Love, probably, as Richard is reminding me, right? Yeah, quite possibly. I don't know, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure survival is what's because actual survival is impossible, right? Survival in place, survival without change. I mean, that's the paradox of change, right? I mean, that's not an achievable goal, and I don't think that's what's driving this thing anyway.
Can I ask a follow-up on that real quick? So what I'm understanding you to say, Mike, is that evolution is not a blind search. Each lineage is searching. The lineage is not necessarily searching for survival, but it's searching for something, right? So we're not clear what it is, and you're proposing the idea of Platonic forms, some sort of idea of Platonic forms as a possible.
Well, I think it's the forms that are the agent here, so to speak, right? I think so. It's more than that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you have a conventional picture of living lineages, and we're going to add one weird thing that they're going to search for. They're going to search for patterns in the space. That isn't what I'm saying. I mean, that could be right, but I'm pushing it sort of further than that, and I'm saying no. It's actually the patterns that are driving it, and what kind of surge does that look like to us? Okay, at first pass, it might look like an adaptation survival surge first sort of first order, but fundamentally, I don't think it's that at all. And what I think is a more actionable description of it is that what the process is doing is continuously ratcheting up the ability to interface to more and more complex patterns. Like that I think is a better description, and there may be much better ones than that, but I think that's better than the standard story.
So it's kind of searching for competency again, right? The ability to adopt various patterns flexibly depending on
what it looks like to us as external observers is an improved, a continuously improving ability to manifest more and more interesting, more beautiful, I don't know what the right vocabulary is, patterns from this space. Because that's what the patterns are trying to do. It isn't a mutation and selection that's doing this.
Totally. Thanks. Mary?
Hey, thanks for having this conversation, Michael. You've mentioned that you would be possibly open to engaging the ethical and philosophical questions moving into the future. And I move in realms where the idea that we must have a trans human future is very concerning. And you've also mentioned in various videos, at least, I'm not sure in your papers, that you do recognize and accept some concept related to our existence being holonic, having nested intelligence. And it seems that if we are going to be evolving and emerging and bifurcating the human species, then the collective holonic intelligence, it seems like that would be obvious that we would engage that conversation and try to find mechanisms. I mean, this is a very privileged community of very educated, thoughtful people, and it doesn't seem like the masses, the everyday person has much way to weigh in on any of this. So I thank you for offering, and maybe Charlie will reach out and we can set something up, probably with many of the same usual suspects in the room right now.
Sure. I'd be happy to. I mean, these are things I think about a lot because they are, they're critical to what I do or don't do, in the lab. I'm not going to pretend I have any expertise in knowing what is going to happen. People ask me all the time, what's humanity going to do? How do we make? I don't know any of that. I don't know how to make anybody do anything. I don't actually want to make anybody do anything. But I do have some thoughts on what could happen and the reasons why we might or might not want to do that. So I'm happy to have that discussion. And just briefly, I don't actually think that the first thing you said, I don't think that we have to do this. And I think it's great. There are communities now on Earth that live consciously avoiding, for example, technology and medicine and things like that. And that's fine. I think there are some ethical issues there as well, but that's okay. I'm not saying that everybody has to go graft on a third hemisphere and do all this weird stuff, but it would be a complete shock to me if somebody froze me and brought me back 1,000 years from now, and I don't think it's going to take that long, but let's just say 1,000 years from now, and the mature human species, and we were still walking around with our current IQs, lower back pain, astigmatism, and birth defects, and cancer, and all of this stuff. I would be absolutely shocked if that was still going on. I just can't fathom that that's what a mature species spends its life doing. And in particular, worse yet, locked into whatever body it happened to have been given at birth, and that's the limitation of your potential and then of your dreams and whatever is whatever whatever embodiment you just happen to have, whether with what we currently recognize as defects or really just our current limitations. I tend to think that the people of the future are going to look back and it'll be like, when you first go to school and they tell you that, oh, in primitive times, if you stepped on a rusty, whatever, like you'd be dead because I'm like, how could anybody live this way? You could be dead at any moment. I think people are going to look back and they're going to say, I don't understand how they live this way. Having to stay with whatever embodiment you got at birth with no say in it, having to eat other living beings to stay alive. I mean, there'll be a million things that it's going to blow the mind of the children of the future of how we live this way. That's what I anticipate. But that's not to say that I think that everybody needs to have these massive transformations. I'm just talking about on a global scale.
Well, that's a nobly humanitarian first salvo. And yeah, I would like to explore this more fully with you. I heard a conservative commentator, just randomly things showing up in my newsfeed, say today that we should operate on humanity with the same attention that we would operate on our Father, which is to proceed very slowly with lots of second opinions.
I mean, that's true. Proceeding slowly with second opinions, absolutely. However, is the father having sciatica or a heart attack? Because proceeding slowly is nice in certain scenarios, but it's deadly in other scenarios. And I just want to be clear, because I get a lot of emails from people who say what you're doing is scary. Frog skin moving around on its own is too far, whatever that is, and you need to stop, right? And those tend to be the young, healthy people. And then I get the emails that are just, I can't even begin to describe and I'm not even a clinician, but people write to me anyway for some reason. And the amount of biomedical suffering out there is incredible. You can't, I can't even visualize all the things that could happen to a person or to their children or to their father or whatever. And those people are yelling at me in the opposite direction. What they say is, what the hell is taking you so long? Like, hurry up. Because we don't have time to wait for all this nonsense. We are in a constant chronic pain. My kid has a spinal cord defect. I've got cancer, this and that. It is incredible. And I think that we really need to be wary of the standard way people often approach this is they have an unspoken assumption that everything is fine, and you scientists better not screw it up. That's the standard, right? And I get it. There's always unintended consequences. I mean, everything, people try to do the right thing, something good, and then you find out later that, yeah, you invented leaded gasoline so that the car engines wouldn't blow up, but it turns out now, now we all walk around with lead in our bloodstream, right? So these things happen. But I don't think that's the right comparison. It isn't between everything's cool, don't make it worse. Things are absolutely not cool. And I think it is a personally, I think it's an absolute moral imperative to help the people that are having a horrific embodiment. And yes, we can take time to figure certain things out, but we need to be under no illusions that time is not at somebody's expense. Okay, all of these kinds of limiting conversations that we have, maybe on balance are fine, and that's above my pay grade to know, like, how it's all going to play out. But we need to understand that it is always at somebody's expense. It is not just the cautious, safe approach. There is no, I mean, that's the tragedy. There is no cautious, safe approach. It's who are you going to leave in the dust as you do these things, or don't do them, actually.
Amen to that, brother.
Sorry, I think you're muted, Mary.
I think we got time for one more question. I just wanted to open it up and see if anyone, I'm going to be shocked if Richard Watson says nothing this whole time.
Well, Richard and I talk extensively.
It looks like Steve is raising his hand over here. Steve, you got to unmute.
All right, there I am. I'm back
Right.
with you. Yes, thoroughly enjoyed the paper. The paper was awesome. The concepts were awesome. The question of Where is the engram? Where's the pattern? Where's the actual, there's one thing to say, well, there's DNA and whatever, but there's somewhere there's got to be a pattern. And you've got, a plot of like the electrostatic pattern, and that's great. There is a pattern. You draw that bow tie structure where every information gets compressed into a single point and then it gets reified back out again. That is exactly what happens in an optical Fourier transform, where you take an image, you pass it through a simple optical lens, and out the other side comes a Fourier transform computed by waves in parallel analog. I'm very enthusiastic about the electrostatic model, but if there's electrostatic fields in the brain, then surely there must be also oscillating electrostatic fields, because you can pack so much more information in an oscillating field than you can in a regular field. And as to what is the pattern, what is the engram towards which the agential intelligence is going, I do declare that it is the harmonic resonance, the harmony of the pattern, which is the ultimate template towards which the engram seeks. And we can see it even in the most simple one-dimensional world of music, where you have a sound, doo, and its harmonics. Doo, 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 doo. There is not only an architecture, a blueprint, a skeleton, but there's also an aesthetic component to it that everyone everywhere always agrees that harmony is good. And what is it that's bad? Noise, irregularity, chaos, that's bad. And that is the engram. It's explained by harmonic resonance. It explains why the spinal cord of a developing embryo or any other animal divides into periodic structures, because in a morphogenic chemical reaction, circular chemical reaction, what the spinal cord is doing during embryological morphogenesis is it's going boo, it's blowing a note along that axis and dividing the spine into its segments. It's harmonic resonance of a electrochemical form that defines the pattern, and that's where you'll find the engram. I rest my case.
Thanks, Stephen. Look, I'm very sympathetic to that view. I think that probably is what's going on. I think that you might want to have do you know Earl Miller at MIT?
Yes, he's a good friend of mine. Yes,
All right.
yes. And
so
early on, he started the multi-unit electrode recording. And what did he find? Resonance patterns in the brain. And now he's correlating those patterns with behavioral results. Yes, Earl Miller, absolutely. He's a pioneer, I tell you.
He absolutely is. So yeah, that's fantastic. I'm completely open to all that. The only difficulty, and maybe we'll circumvent it in some way. The difficulty is this: the bioelectric patterns that we deal with. And the reasons I say that this is where the pattern is not because it's not just because we can see them and they look cool. It's because specifically by modifying those patterns in very specific ways, we get to control the downstream anatomy, right, in ways that hadn't been done before. So I know these patterns are functionally encoding specific things. Those patterns change extremely slowly. So the change that we see in those patterns is on the scale of tens of minutes to hours. So, people ask me all the time, frequencies, is it gigahertz or is it megahertz, that's the problem, is that like if you can tell the story you just told, that's using the harmonics that are that slow, maybe we've got something here, and then I need to hear how it is that we go about controlling them. So I don't know, but I'm sure you and I could figure it out. But that's the initial thing, is that there are not the kind of overt cyclical frequencies that you see in brain data and so on. They're just not like that, at least as far as we can tell. But we could be missing important aspects of it for sure.
Can't those patterns be the standing waves?
They well could. So what would we? So the question is, if we wanted to see the thing that Stephen was just talking about, what would we be measuring? Because we already measure the thing we know how to measure, but then again, you only detect what your tools let you, right? So maybe we're measuring the wrong thing. I'm open to that. I just don't know what that would be. I'm very sympathetic that underneath all of it there is some kind of that these are in fact standing waves, sort of harmonic, but I don't know how.
That would mean the wave is in some other medium. Yeah.
Right, and I don't know how to get
yeah. There you are. I said something, Charlie.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was very helpful. Awesome. Well, guys, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time, and thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. And
everybody. Some amazing and extremely difficult questions to none of which I know the answer. So thank you. Good stuff to think.
That was fantastic. And next month we have Perry Marshall, the author of
Nice.
the Evolution 2.0 prize, and he's got an interesting paper. And so let's meet back again, same place, and it'll be the first Wednesday of the month in the afternoon too. And everybody that was new to the call, or if a friend of yours jumped on the call today, please have them send me an email, and I'd love to get to know them and have them join in. And we've got some new friends and a great community going on here. So if any of you guys have ideas, we don't probably have time to talk too much about it, but if you've got new ideas for meetings, stay on the call for a few minutes, or hit me up and we'll talk later. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for, oh my God. It's awesome. Oh my God.
Wow. Oh, there's a new member. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks so much for pulling this together. Like this is great. I'm so glad that this exists. So this is just awesome. Yeah. So good job. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Right on.
Hi,
Thanks.
Charlie. I'm going to stay for a minute just to say hello. I know we've met because through Dennis, but as you
Yeah.
can see, I'm a little busy, so it's nice to make it when I can.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was so
Absolutely.
fun.
And thank you
Yeah.
so much for putting this together and for asking such thoughtful questions.
Oh, well, they were a product of much collaboration, I promise you. But yeah, it's a lot of deep stuff. It's hard to cover it quickly. So, but yeah.
All right, bye.
Thanks. Bye. Robert, thanks for joining. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. No, this was great. And good
Fantastic.
questions as well. I think
Fantastic.
there's so much potential
Absolutely.
with a lot of minds sort of almost dancing around the same, whatever it is, fire going on.
Totally.
It's-
Totally.
it's
Absolutely.
really
Do
exciting.
you see how your work really works at some of the same stuff from a new angle? That's
Oh, yeah.
yeah, totally.
I need to put some more stuff, more of my ideas out there for other people to see.